Never play to the gallery. But you never learn that until much later on, I think. But never work for other people. Always remember that the reason that you initially started working was that there was something inside yourself that you felt that if you could manifest it in some way, you would understand more about yourself and how you coexist with the rest of society. I think it's terribly dangerous for an artist to fulfill other people's expectations. I think they generally produce their worst work when they do that. The other thing I would say is that if you feel safe in the area that you're working in, you're not working in the right area. Always go a little further into the water than you feel you're capable of being in. Go a little bit out of your depth. And when you don't feel that your feet are quite touching the bottom, you're just about in the right place to do something exciting.
And that is what this video is all about. Why you shouldn't be creating for an audience. Because the truth is, most creators and writers and artists don't fail because they lack talent. The main reason most of them fail is because they create an audience that they fail to grow out of. Today, I'm going to show you why writing for an audience is a massive trap, and how building for yourself is actually the only way to survive. So to start off, I think it would be helpful to actually look at the story of David Bowie. So obviously a lot of people know who David Bowie is now, but he wasn't always this superstar. His first album was completely forgotten. His second album wasn't that successful, even though he did come out with his big mega hit, Ground Control to Major Tom. But the rest of the album wasn't very successful. And even after that, he was coming out with very impressive projects, but he was failing to become a superstar. All of that changed when he released the Ziggy Stardust album and created this character. Now, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Do you think that Ziggy Stardust was a creation he had because he was trying to create something that an audience would like? Or do you think he just became fascinated with this alien rock star idea and decided to run with it, to create music about it, to create this larger-than-life figure and perform as the character? The answer is obviously the latter, because before Ziggy Stardust, there was nothing like that. Yes, okay, there were glam rock people, but there was no one taking those characters to those lengths in the way Ziggy Stardust did. You have to bear in mind, before Ziggy Stardust, David Bowie was not like a bona fide superstar. Ziggy Stardust is what made him a household name and what made him extremely famous. So before he ever came out with this idea for this music, for this character, it was a big risk for him. He was taking a massive risk. There was no obvious evidence that this is what people wanted. He could have easily created Ziggy Stardust and ruined his career. It was a massive gamble, and it paid off because he was following his curiosity and because he was trying to make what he wanted to make. But what's really fascinating about the whole Ziggy Stardust episode in Bowie's career is that as soon as Ziggy Stardust was at the peak of its popularity, he lost interest in the character, in the songs, and he wanted to move on, because that's just how he was as an artist. He was constantly reinventing himself, and he always felt that he had to push himself in order to get better. So that's exactly what he did. Ziggy Stardust is the character that made him this superstar, this rock god. And just as Ziggy Stardust was peaking in popularity, he killed the character. And he moved on, even though that is what his audience wanted. His audience were more in love with Ziggy Stardust than they were David Bowie. So for him to prioritize his own artistic curiosity and his own interests over the thing that was making him a lot of money, making him very popular, was very courageous. And it's what many artists would never do. They would never sacrifice the gravy train in favor of their own interests and their own passions, where their curiosity is leading them. And that is the main reason why David Bowie is heralded as this incredible artist. It's because he didn't sacrifice the things that he wanted to do in favor of money, in favor of status. He got all of those things as a result of following the things he wanted to do. And my argument is that this is exactly what you need to do as a writer. You need to constantly be evolving. You need to constantly be challenging yourself. You need to be writing not just for an audience, but for yourself. You need to realize, you need to find your place in this world. You need to write about things to try and make sense of where you fit. You need to write to try and make sense of this thing we call reality in the world. And you can't do that if you're constantly trying to appease a crowd. If you create for the crowd, you're going to lose your soul. You're going to lose the thing that made you special. And this is what you find with Hollywood, right? For example, what are all these Disney remakes? What are they? They're just vapid. There's a reason why people don't like them. It's because they're unoriginal. They're literally remakes. But when these things first came out, people loved them. Because Disney was operating from a place of passion, from a place of curiosity, from a place of trying to tell the best story. Obviously, it's a massive company. They were always profit-driven, okay? But at one point, they were making much better content than they are now. That's undeniable. And you have to say that at one point, Disney was clearly prioritizing storytelling over profit to a certain extent. There's a reason why they were able to come out with original pieces of work during the 90s, during their heyday. The stuff they were making then is completely unrecognizable to the things they're making now, even though the things they're making now are remakes of the things they made before. And what's happening? People are losing trust in Disney because of just the poor storytelling that they're doing. The poor creative decisions that they're making in favor of business success. Now, I'm not saying like Disney are wrong for doing this. It is what it is. But there's a clear difference between David Bowie, who was a business. David Bowie was a business. David Bowie was a brand. And a Disney. They were two completely different philosophies on how to create things. And I would argue you as a writer would be much better off following the David Bowie model over the Disney model. So I know I'm talking about these abstract things. I'm comparing you as a writer to like this massive corporation like Disney and this groundbreaking artist like David Bowie. But it is relevant, and I hope you're beginning to see that. Now I want to talk about just basic things about the concept of an audience. You need to understand that audiences evolve. You evolve. A company like Disney evolves. David Bowie was always evolving. Evolution is unavoidable. It's happening all the time, whether we like it or not. And I'm not saying this from like a Darwinian perspective. I'm just saying as a reality perspective. All things are always evolving. If you try to cut your evolution short in favor of what an audience wants now, you're going to trap yourself. An example from YouTube is someone like Hamza. I'm on YouTube quite a lot, so I know all these people. Hamza is this self-improvement YouTuber, and he laments quite a lot about the audience he built during the early part of his career. He created this audience based on these very, in his words, childish videos, like these cartoons and things like that. Really optimized for retention videos that were very stimulating, very colorful, very entertainment driven. And in recent months, he's talked about how that was a mistake, how he regrets doing that, because when he tried to evolve, his audience wasn't receptive to that. He built his entire brand for this specific audience, but when he wanted to evolve as a person, as a creator, that audience became hostile to his decision to change. They were saying things like, oh, you're changed, you're not the same anymore, all this stuff, right? And this is a big problem of creating things for an audience and not for yourself. The fact is, you cannot lead people by staying the same. You have to change, you have to evolve, and you have to attract the right people as you evolve. You cannot create things for the people who follow you. Because if you do that, you will not be able to change. You will not be able to grow as a person and create the things you're supposed to be creating. Because even though you might be winning their approval, there's a much bigger trap waiting for you just around the corner. And to explain that, I'm going to share a different example, again in the world of music. Once upon a time, there was a band called the Beatles. The Beatles started off as this very trendy band. They were very image-driven. They made music that was very focused on a specific demographic, mainly young girls. And they sang about love and holding hands and all this stuff, right? It was nice pop music for the time. I'm not saying they were bad songs. But there is clearly a difference between the Beatles that were touring all the time and making music for live events and the Beatles that came afterwards when they stopped doing any touring and they decided to purely focus on the music. One version of the Beatles was creating for an audience. The other version of the Beatles was creating for them. as artists, and you can clearly see a massive difference between the work being created. The first period of the Beatles was quite surface level. It was nice, it was cute, it is what it is. But the second wave, the second evolution of the Beatles, was some of the greatest music ever produced. And it was all created because of their passions, because of their interests. They achieved so much fame and fortune doing the first stuff that they were able to have enough skin in the game to convince their record label to let them do what they wanted. And even though these were perceived as huge risks at the time, it paid off so much for them. Even though they weren't going on tour, they were still making so much money, and their music was getting so much better. And counterintuitively, all of this happened after they stopped making music for an audience. Now, let's compare that to a band like U2 that did the absolute opposite. U2 were a big band in the 80s. They started off making pretty interesting music, but after a while they just started treating music like a business instead. They'd release greatest hits albums instead of creating any new material, and they would just cash in on these massive shows. U2 is not respected as a band in the same way the Beatles are. It's not even close. Even though U2 are one of the most successful bands ever from a purely revenue standpoint. Another artist who did the complete opposite thing to U2 and always prioritized creation over what an audience wanted was Prince. Prince is one of the most prolific musicians to ever live, and his entire life was centered around creation. He literally did not give a shit about what his audience wanted. All he cared about was the stuff he was making. Prince recorded thousands of things without even releasing them to the public because he literally didn't care about the public. All he cared about was making things for him, the things he was interested in. While U2 sounded like a Spotify algorithm, Prince was constantly evolving multiple albums every single year, and he was always changing his sound. And yet, he managed to maintain an audience throughout. U2 made a lot more money than him, fine, but is that really what's the most important thing? Is that really the priority? In the eyes of most serious music people, U2's a joke, whereas Prince is the man. Prince is a king. As a writer with integrity, who would you rather be? Would you rather be the billionaire, like U2, but not be respected as an artist? Not create anything meaningful? Or would you rather be like Prince, a multi-millionaire who just constantly made whatever he wanted to make? Because even if you were to write something extremely successful, what if you hated what you wrote? What if you made all these blog posts, all these pieces of content that performed really well, but you hated every single second you were making those things? And because those things were extremely successful, you will have an audience for all of those things. Now what do? You're making money. You're getting views. Your audience is going crazy for the things you're making. But on the other hand, you just hate it. You hate every single second of it. Now, this actually happened in the world of music. I don't know if you've ever heard of a band called MGMT. MGMT were a band that came out in like the early 2000s alongside Tame Impala. They were making like psychedelic pop music. Well, what's interesting about MGMT is they released an album called Oracular Spectacular, and they did it as a joke. This album was just a complete joke. They were trying to make the most poppiest record they could. And what happened was this album blew up in popularity. They made it as a joke, and audiences unironically started liking it. So what happened? This band had a career off a joke, and they had to keep performing those songs at all these live shows, even though they didn't like the songs. They thought they were just piss takes. They literally made them as piss takes, and yet they got trapped by their audience because they were making a lot of money from these songs. Imagine if your biggest success was something you absolutely resented. Would you want that? Would you really want that for yourself? Would you want to write book after book that you just hated but was paying you so much money? As an artist, you don't want that. As a creator, you do not want that. Why would you want that when you can have the other option? It's not a binary option, by the way. There are so many ways you can do this. Why would you want to choose money while doing something you hate, while you can do something you love and still make a lot of money? and not be trapped by an audience. This is possible for you. People have done it and you can do it as well. Another musical example of this is Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is now regarded as one of the best songwriters ever. But there was a time when he was facing a very similar dilemma to David Bowie. He was at a crossroads. He wanted to evolve as an artist and venture into more electric rock and roll kind of music. But he built his name off of being a folk singer. And in the folk scene at that time, it was all acoustic guitars and a voice. There was this hive mind that existed in that space where they didn't need to do all this electric stuff. If it sounds good, it sounds good. That was basically the mindset. Therefore, you can just sing and play an acoustic guitar. And Bob Dylan alienated that entire core audience that he developed by playing electric rock music at one of these folk festivals. People were going insane. People were trying to kill him. They were throwing beer bottles at him. They were throwing tomatoes. They were throwing everything at him. And they made their voices clear. They did not want this. But Bob Dylan did not give a shit. Right? Bob Dylan prioritized his own artistic curiosities over what he was expected to do by his audience. And that paid off. That again was an enormous risk. David Bowie, enormous risk making Ziggy Stardust. Even bigger risk, killing Ziggy Stardust and moving on. The Beatles, huge risk. The Beatles made an enormous risk when they started making Sgt. Pepper. That was a huge risk. It could have easily flopped and they wouldn't have had the same career. Bob Dylan, massive risk. He was the guy in folk music and he decided to throw all of that away in exchange for the music and the songs that he was more interested in writing. They made these massive risks because their audience liked them for a very specific thing. But it all paid off. It all worked itself out in the end. It didn't matter that David Bowie killed Ziggy Stardust. Sure, many fans would have not liked that decision, but it didn't hurt his career. It made him even more legendary as an artist. The same with the Beatles. The same with Bob Dylan. The reality is, you do not become timeless by playing it safe. You become timeless by evolving, which is naturally what you have to do anyway. So, as a writer, I just want you to understand that you're not here to blend in. You're not here to play it safe. You're here to lead. What do people do when they follow you? You're a writer. If people click follow on social media, what are they doing? They're asking you to lead. They're not telling you to make stuff they want. They're saying, I want to hear what you have to say. That's what real creators and real writers do. So, consider this me giving you permission to start creating and just ignore what your audience wants. If you create the stuff you want to create, your audience will find you. And if you make stuff that you are so in love with, you care about so deeply, there will be an audience for you, regardless of what you make. I don't care if you're writing bloody cookbooks. If you go from writing best-selling novels to cookbooks, you will still have people coming. Pause. You will still have people wanting to read your work. Why? Because it doesn't matter what you write. If you wrote your best-selling novel with the same passion that you write that cookbook, people will still come to you. Don't worry about an audience. Create what you want to create. You don't want to be like these fucking U2 sellouts. You want to be like Prince. You want to be like the Beatles. You want to make things that actually matter to you. You don't want to make things just because it pays the bills. Trust me, I've been there and I regret it. I want to make things I want to make. I want to write things I want to write. And if people like it, great. If they don't, fine. It's not for them. The right people will find you, and the wrong ones were never meant to be in your audience anyway. If you want to learn how to start attracting people, click the first link in the description and get Magnetic Writing. It's a free email course. I think you'll like it. If you're serious about taking your writing skills to the next level and you want to learn the easiest way to become a content creator in 2025, click the second link in the description and read my sales page. And remember, writers write, artists evolve, and creators lead. Be one of them. And watch this next video where I'll show you the secret trick writers use to hook you. You'll be able to use these skills to your advantage as well. Bye.